in order to understand the role of the JNF in the Nakba, we have to go back a little bit before the Nakba, that is before 1948, to see how the JNF changed its mission in a way as part of the Zionist project in Palestine. When the Jewish National Fund was established in 1901, the idea was that it will help to recruit money in order to purchase land in Palestine for colonization. What it did after the initial funding went quite well was to start and studying the land regime in Palestine in order to make sure that not only land is purchased, but also that the old land regime in Palestine would not stand in the way of a project of settler colonialism, which wanted not only to buy land, but also to evict the people who lived in that land. So they were very busy, I would say, at least until 1936, that is from 1901 to 1936, first under Ottoman rule and then under British rule, to find a way by which they could, in a way, reject the custom of the land that allowed transfer of ownership of land, but never included or incurred the eviction of the tenants who were the actual landowners. Even if the owners of the land lived in Beirut and they used to sell it to someone else, this never affected the villages on the land, because we're talking about large swaths of land there. What the JNF was very good at, especially with the help of the British Mandatory Authority, is to import into Palestine a European entitlement laws that would enable it not just to purchase land, but also to evict the farmers who lived on those lands for centuries. Once this system was exposed by the Palestinian national movement, people stopped selling land to the Zionist movement, first in Palestine and later outside of Palestine. And that's when the JNF had to change its tactics and its own understanding of how can it help for the settler colonial project of Zionism, which is actually a project, as you all know, of displacement and replacement, of taking the land with as few Palestinians on it as possible. So it's not surprising that if you look at the documents of the JNF from 1936 until the Nakba, you can see a change of discourse. You can see also a realization, probably even before some of the Zionist leaders realized, that the method of purchasing land and evicting by force the people who lived on it would not allow the Zionist project to acquire enough land to build a Jewish state. In fact, by the time we reach 1947, in such a method, the JNF was able to purchase for the Zionist community less than 6% of the land of Palestine. So obviously, this method that had some successes and achievements in the 1920s in buying land and evicting Palestinians who lived on it stopped being effective and definitely did not deliver an amount of land that seemed enough or appropriate for creating a state in the future. So the leaders of, or the people who were running the Jewish National Fund in around 1936 become a lobby that is pressuring the Zionist leadership under David Ben-Gurion to adopt the idea of a transfer, as they call it, a forced transfer, what today we will call ethnic cleansing. And in fact, they, under the auspices of the Jewish National Fund in 1937, a special committee of experts is being was convened, run by the Jewish National Fund to prepare a strategy for transferring Palestinians outside of Palestine by all possible means. Because of the outbreak of the Second World War, the clashes between the Zionist gangs and the British mandate during the Second World War and after the Second World War, the attention to the idea of transfer or ethnic cleansing was marginalized for a while, and the JNF did not play an important role in Zionist strategy up to the moment that Britain decided to leave Palestine, which happened on the 1st of February 1947. From that moment onwards, ideas that were on paper in 1936, I could call them ideas of wishful thinking, of hypothetical scenarios that might be implemented if the circumstances would be right, were transformed into actual strategy with the very same personalities who prepared these ideas back in the 1930s when it was clear that the Zionist movement will not be able by, I wouldn't even call it legal means, to purchase land, because what they did was illegal as well, but by building a state through purchase of land and not through occupation, colonization, and expulsion. So their ideas become a strategy. I should say that even before 1947, they already did something very important, which helped them to appear as very systematic and knowledgeable in the eyes of the Zionist leadership when they came with the idea of massive ethnically cleansing the Palestinians on the day that Britain decided to leave Palestine. And I refer to this particular project of theirs between 1936 to 1947 in my book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and I called it the Village Files. The JNF was busy together with the intelligence service of the Haganah, the main paramilitary outfit of the Jewish community, in preparing a file for every Palestinian village. All the 1,000 Palestinian villages, each one of them had a file with very detailed information that had two aims in mind. One is to assess the richness, if one could call it, or the value of the land, its quality, and the village kind of productivity, in order to create a kind of a hierarchy of deciding which villages are particularly important to take over when the circumstances would allow it, and which villages could be left for later on. So that was one aim. The second aim was to know about the social life in the village with the hope of creating some sort of a network of collaboration in the villages that would ease their future occupation and expulsion during the Nakba. So with all this kind of systematic knowledge and this kind of a lobby impulse, if you want, the JNF played a very important role. Of course, they were not the final decision makers, but they provided a sense that it's doable, that there's already a systematic preparation for it, which I think made it easier for the leader of the Jewish community, David Ben-Gurion, and his close advisors to decide roughly around February 1947 to think more systematically about the massive ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians once the British would leave Palestine. In fact, a year later, in February 1948, the JNF leaders successfully pressured the leadership of the Zionist movement not to wait for the final withdrawal of the British, which happened on the 15th of May 1948, which we commemorate as the Nakba Day. But already in February 1948, that is a year after they started seriously thinking of how to implement an ethnic cleansing, a year later, the decision fell that you don't need to wait for the British in order to take over both the urban space and the countryside, at least part of it, and Judaize it, colonize it, by occupying the places and evicting the Palestinians from their homes, villages, and neighborhoods. And they played a very active role. And as you probably know from the work of new historians in Israel and Palestinian historians, the documentation for this is very rich and very convincing. And I think this is not anymore under any debate. That this was the planning and this was the impulse, the main impulse. The JNF played another important role. One of the problems that at least what one can call the left Zionist wing of the Zionist leadership had, and the JNF played an important role in solving the so-called problem for the left Zionist wing. Their problem was that in some Palestinian villages were mixed. There were Jewish residents living in some of these Palestinian villages, and some of the kibbutzim, the kibbutz settlements of the left-wing Zionist parties had very good and close relationship with Palestinian villages. In fact, they had a kind of agreements, peaceful agreements, that whatever would happen after the British would leave, there will be no aggression on either side towards the neighbors. Kind of a non-aggression pact, I think would be the right way of calling it. The JNF sent its own people to convince the Jews who lived in Palestinian villages and the Jewish settlements who had these arrangements with villages to violate these arrangements and to play a very important role in the eviction of the villages which already hosted Jews since the beginning of the mandate as part of hospitality and a way of coexistence that was quite typical to Palestine before the Nakba. The JNF made sure that these people will not only stop being an hindrance for the massive ethnic cleansing, but that they actually will take a more active part in it. The next stage that I think is important to consider when we think about the JNF and its role in the Nakba is the role it played immediately after a village was occupied and its people were expelled, or after a neighborhood in a city or a town was occupied and its people were expelled. Again, I just want to make clear the JNF did not take the decision to expel. This was a decision taken by the leadership, the political and military leadership of the Zionist community. The JNF was part of that leadership and therefore bears a responsibility for the ethnic cleansing by being part of that leadership. But it has a particular role to account for, as I mentioned, until now. The second kind of phase in the JNF role is what it was its involvement in the arrangements, so to speak, of how to run a village few moments or few days after it was occupied and its people were expelled. In some cases, as you know, quite a few cases, these expulsions were accompanied by massacres. The role of the army ended there. And the empty village and its deserted lands were entrusted in the hands of the Jewish National Front. The first thing that they would do, and this is already in June, July 1948, when out of the 531 villages that Israel destroyed, already about 400 villages were already done. And most of the urban space was already taken by the Israeli forces. So already in June, July, they organized bulldozers and tractors to flatten the houses of many villages so as to prevent the repatriation, the return of the refugees. The reason that they felt the urgency to do it when, in a way, their military confrontation with the military units that came from the Arab world have not ended yet. The war, this part of the war, ended only in at the beginning of 1949. The reason that they were decided to devote so much attention to erasure, to the erasing the villages already while the fighting with the Egyptians and the Syrians and the Arab Liberation Army was still going on, was that already the international community, first through the services of the mediator Count Folt Bernadotte, and later through other agencies of the United Nations, and even emissaries coming from the United States, sent a very clear message to Israel that whatever the reason was for people leaving their villages or towns, in a way, the world expects Israel to allow these people to return once the fighting has subsided. And the thinking that, and this is a pure JNF thinking, was that if I destroy your home and I take over your land, it doesn't matter what the international law would say or what the international pressure on us would be, you won't be able to come back because there's nothing to come back to. This was not enough. There was another project that the JNF almost volunteered to take over, and two other projects actually, which are important to mention in this context. I think I'll mention even three of them now that I'm thinking about it. Three projects which are important. So first of all, the flattening of houses, taking over the land with the hope that this prevents return of people, because you don't know how the international community would react, if it would have the power to pressure the new state to allow repatriation, whether Israel would have the power to prevent people from returning. And therefore it was important to wipe out the villages and the neighborhoods. The next step, the first out of three steps, was to make sure that these villages are defined as ancient Hebrew villages, biblical villages, Jewish villages of the past. A method that Israel would use also in justifying Jewish settlements in the West Bank after 1967. Here, the JNF recruited a group of Israeli archaeologists who did not do any archaeology, but used their allegedly archaeological expertise to confirm for the JNF that Safaria is an ancient Jewish village by the name of Tzipori, and so on and so forth for hundreds of Palestinian villages, and therefore flattening the village and taking over the land was actually an act of redemption, returning. This was the real repatriation. The Jews were coming back to villages which they lost during the time of the Romans 2,000 years before 1948. The second project was recruiting recruiting pundits, literati, men of culture and poets and writers to help and give Hebrew names to to the so-called Jewish villages, as was confirmed by the archaeologists. So the JNF was this huge kind of operation that was not busy anymore in just buying land or even advocating the expulsion of the Palestinians. It was now the main mechanism, it oversaw the main mechanism of how to erase the Palestinian identity of Palestine by wiping out the place, by claiming that it used to be an ancient Jewish state. And the next step was creating a naming committee that would give it a Hebrew name. The next two projects that they were involved with was in places where it seemed that it would be difficult to build a Jewish settlement over the ruins of a Palestinian villages. They decided to plant European forests on the ruins of the Palestinian villages. They imported 10,000 European pine trees. And the purpose was twofold. One was to cover the ruins of the village so that it would be erased from memory, from collective memory, and from the sight and conscious of people. The second reason was Ben-Gurion's obsession with trying to change the landscape. He didn't like what he called the Arab landscape. Both the urban landscape and the natural landscape looked to him so-called, as he called it, Arab, and he wanted to Europeanize it. And therefore, some of the most beautiful part of the Palestinian natural habitat were destroyed in such a way in order to, and were substituted with European foresting that was alien to the land. In fact, most of these forests did not survive, but they were enough to destroy some beautiful parts. Just 2 days ago, I'm doing a project on the Nakba with some Palestinian friends, and we drove through the beautiful ruined village of Sohmata. Sohmata was known, apart from many other things, it had next to it, it had a forest of very rare cider trees. The Galilee cider is a bit different from the Lebanese cider. Beautiful cider trees. They look too Arab to the JNF, so they ruined these cider forests and planted ugly pine trees forests. I say ugly not because the pine tree is ugly, because they are alien to that beautiful scenery there. But that's the kind of thing that they did. They also covered the whole mountains of Jerusalem with these pine trees. So the forestation project was one of the second of the three projects I was talking about, or the four, I don't remember the numbers, because you had the wiping of the village, the archaeology confirmation that it was a Jewish place, the naming committee that gave it a Jewish name, and deforestation was the next step. The last step, and this took a while. This didn't happen in 1948. It took a while, and it was completed in 1953, was to settle Jews either in the houses if they were left of Palestinian villages, but because of most cases, the JNF destroyed the houses, building new homes for them on the ruins of the Palestinian villages. The few exceptions that we have of villages that remain intact, but to which Jews moved into, the few exceptions have to do with villages that look to the Bohemian artists of Tel Aviv, particularly beautiful, like in Haud, and therefore they, or Lifta, and they insisted that they should remain intact, but of course without the people living in them. Uh, Parts of old Jaffa were rescued in such a way because the Bohemians or the artists or whatever you want to call this kind of milieu in Tel Aviv pressured the government not to destroy these beautiful houses because they wanted to live in them, and therefore the houses were spared, but the people were expelled. My hometown Haifa was not that lucky in terms of houses. Of course, nobody was lucky in terms of people. And the JNF had a kind of a sister company that dealt with the urban space. And that company was responsible for two things. One is to destroy massively Arab houses in order to change the character of places such as Jaffa, Acre, Haifa, and make sure that they don't look Arab anymore. And the only way of doing it was to demolish systematically a large number of Palestinian houses. In Haifa, they also demolished one of the most beautiful covered markets in the Eastern Mediterranean in the process. And that company, Hinuma, that was responsible for that. The second purpose that they had, it was very clear that under the new reality that was created when the fighting was over, when the massive expulsions were over, talking about 1950, 1951, that there was still a sizable number of Palestinians inside the state of Israel, what the Israelis would call later the Arab minority in Israel. And the question was, will these people be able to resettle in Haifa, in Alid, in Ramle, in Jaffa, in Akka? And the role of this sister company was to make sure that any houses, which were Palestinian houses, that were now in the hands of the JNF, and according to complicated mechanism to which I will not go into, were sort of transferred from the army to the state, and from the state to the JNF, and from the JNF to private people, individuals who wanted to buy them, or institutions, or governments, or the army. It was a whole kind of cycle of legal way of organizing the pillage of these houses, or the land on which these houses used to be on. The purpose of this sister company was to make sure that these houses will never be sold to non-Jews, which is part of the charter of the JNF anyway, is to keep the land, the houses, anything which is under the possession of the JNF has to be kept for the Jewish people, not the Jewish people in Palestine, for the Jewish people around the world, and only be sold to Jews, and it's forbidden to rent, lease, or sell them to non-Jews. So this kind of secured legally, although it could have been done forcefully anyway, that the Judaization of large parts of Jaffa, especially Jaffa and Haifa worried them because these were the two big cities, that the Judaization of Haifa and Jaffa would go on unhindered. And if there would be a Palestinian minority in those two places, they would be confined to special neighborhoods that the Israelis themselves called the ghettos in 1950, and not to the rest of the town. So in Jaffa, all the people who remained in Jaffa were moved forcefully to a neighborhood called Ajami, and all the people in Haifa were forcefully moved into a neighborhood called Wadi Nisnas. The JNF was an important, through its agency in the cities, was an important tool to make sure that this internal ethnic cleansing, if you want, within the massive ethnic cleansing, would continue. Let me conclude, because I promised to talk for 35 to 40 minutes. The JNF is not responsible for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The culprits are the Zionist leaders, ideologues, and strategies who decided already the very beginning of the Zionist project that the only way of creating a Jewish state in Palestine was by replacing the Palestinians, displacing them, ethnically cleansing. However, many of these leaders were also members of the directorship or the management of the JNF. So the JNF is part of it, as was the Israeli army, or before that, the Israeli military units, and all the other representative bodies that were running the Zionist community, and later the State of Israel. However, the JNF interests us, and I don't have to tell you this because that's why we are having this webinar, is because it's one of its particular barbaric act of planting forests, resort parks, picnic areas on the ruins of Palestinian village was successfully sold to the Jewish public in Israel, to the Jewish public around the world, to the non-Jewish audiences around the world as an act of ecology, as part of keeping the green lungs of Israel, as an ecological act of preservation and of a project that has to do with maintaining the natural beauty and the ecology of historical Palestine. And that's why a lot of people, Jews and non-Jews, were gladly giving their names as donors to the village, to the forest that were planted on the ruins of Palestinian villages. A very good campaign succeeded in convincing at least some of them to regret and to apologize to the Palestinian survivors for being part of that act of erasure. But I think that's why we want to study and examine so closely the role of the JNF. The army might have been, and with this I would end, the army had the troops on the ground that went into a village, kicked the people out, massacred them, expelled them. The JNF made sure that the military action would be transformed into a successful act of colonization, dispossession, and Judaization that the world accepted and therefore could be used again in the Galilee in the 1960s and the 1970s, can be used again in the Greater Jerusalem area today, in the south of Mount Hebron, in the Jordan Valley, in the Nakba. The ongoing Nakba, or Nakba al-Mustamira, is possible partly because part of the Israeli actions are still described and conveyed as an act of ecological preservation by an organization, an outfit, which actually is one of the last active colonialist agencies still around in our world in the 21st century. So I will stop here and will gladly take your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Ilan. That was really very useful, and we have quite a number of questions coming in. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can, but there's a couple of questions just relating to the status, and you did clarify there at the end there, the status of the JNF KKL in the Zionist movement. So, you know, and in your book as well, you say that the JNF was established in 1901, and it was a key tool for Zionist colonization. And one of the questions that we had, which I think you answered at the end, is about the role of Joseph Whites, you know, because he was JNF, but also part of the Zionist movement leadership.
That's right.
So in terms of the decisions being made there, and also one of the other questions about the role, if any, that the JNF played prior to the Nakba. So the development of the Plan Dalet, for example. So could you say a little bit about that? So the status of the JNF-KKL, I mean, obviously there are different strands to the Zionist movement, there are different institutions or institutions, you know, pre-state Israel, but what specifically was the role in 1901 from as a Zionist, from the European, you know, decision until today? And do you think their status and role has changed in any way? Obviously, the things that they do in response to the facts on the ground, if you like, has developed, they've adapted, but essentially, has it changed?
Well, of course, something that started in 1901 is not the same in 2021. This is more than 120 years now in existence. But basically, the best way of understanding how it still maintains its same role within the colonization of Palestine is to understand that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, not a colonialist movement, but a settler colonial movement. And settler colonial movements, as the late Patrick Wood used to say, or settler colonialism rather than settler colonial movement. Settler colonialism is a structure. It's not an event. It doesn't happen one day. The Nakba is not a discrete event that never happened before and is not going to happen again. The Nakba is a structural event that started long before 1948 and unfortunately continues until today. So the JNF plays the same role from 1901 until today. What changes are the circumstances, its capacities, its capabilities, but its main role is to recruit money for taking over land, where possible by buying the land, as they do in helping Jews to buy land in the West Bank in the 1970s or in the Galilee, or using their power at times of war or time of violence to take land by force, by making sure that any land taken is totally controlled by a Jewish outfit and is only being transacted with Jews. So in many ways, the DNA of the JNF has not changed. I think we find it difficult to understand because it's difficult to understand colonialism in the 21st century. It's easier to understand it in 1901, but it is still a colonialist and settler colonialist project, and therefore the same method of appearing as caring about the green lungs of a place, of the ecology of the place, the same methods of getting money from the Jewish communities and non-Jewish communities in the world to fund these actions, and where necessary using force in order to take over land and making sure that this land remains Jewish. This hasn't changed. The first successful JNF act of dispossession happened in 1926. It took them 25 years. They were not able before that. But in 1926, with the help of the British mandatory authorities, in two places, in Marj ibn Ammar and in Wadi Hawaris, the JNF was able to take over land and kick out the people who lived there. And just recently, they did the same in the West Bank. So here you have, of course, the circumstances are different between 1926 and 2021, but the DNA is the same DNA. It's the same group that tends to be a charity group in Britain that wants the money and the support of the British elite, supposedly as an ecological outfit, but is an active mechanism of colonization.
Okay, thank you. There's a good question here about what do we know about the sharing of financial resources between or among the JNF, Zionist forces, and other Zionist institutions, you know, up to and during the Nakba?
Yeah, well, up to the Nakba, the JNF was not doing too well financially because funding was not going to the JNF itself. The funding was used for other purposes. But once the Nakba, once 1948 rather ended, they were entrusted with real estate. Land is an asset. Land in urban spaces is even more valuable than land in the countryside. So they became a very rich agency. And here, if you want, there was a battle for the spoils vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis the army, vis-a-vis institutions. But only recently, it's quite amazing, only recently, some investigative Israeli journalists looked at all these periods from 1948 until today, and it appeared that the JNF, either in individual corruption or institutional corruption, was also part of this project. I mean, apart from taking over land, taking over land, making sure that this land remains in Jewish hands, there was also a lot of affluence, or sort of dividends, rather, not affluence, dividends going with it. They made a lot of profit out of it. And some of the profit were kept for their own budgets. Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, I think it was 2 years ago, tried to find out why do they have still millions and millions of dollars in their account. Because basically Israel does not buy land anymore. Unfortunately, they almost took all the land they want now. The rest of the land where Palestinians live, Israel wants to strangulate they don't want the land, they want to strangulate the Palestinians in enclaves. So Israel doesn't want to buy the Gaza Strip. It wants to do different things to the Gaza Strip, but not to buy it. So the millions are there because this is the corrupted inertia of an organization who is actually the official robber or pillager in the name, first of all, of the ideological movement, and then in the name of the state. And therefore, it has complex relationship with the state. I just want to add one more sentence. During the time of Ariel Sharon as the prime minister, the beginning of this century, he began a project of privatizing the national land. And that created a bit of a problem for the JNF, because if private people are coming instead of the JNF, that controlled almost 93% of the land in Israel. But they found a way to be part of a new outfit, that the Israeli Land Authority, that makes sure that, I would say, still 93% of the land in Israel can only be sold to Jews and not given to Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, and using its power in areas like Greater Jerusalem and other areas in the occupied West Bank to expand Jewish settlement.
Okay, that's really useful. I'm going to return back to the Israel Land Authority and Sheikh Jarrah as well. They've got a couple of questions about what's happening today, especially in East Jerusalem. But just going back to before the Nakba, so there's a question here. Why did some Jews live in Palestinian village? How long had they been there before or after Zionist settlement? So really a bit of the history, if you like, in terms of you know who were there, who were in these villages. You had you know different Palestinian Jewish communities across Palestine, historic Palestine.
Yes, it's very difficult, I think, for people today to understand how Palestine was before the Nakba. And in fact, the Nakba is also a catastrophe in that sense. It was a fabric. It was a kind of a mosaic of communities. Some living one next to another, some living one inside another. And in many ways, the Jewish settlers, especially those who didn't do too well, and maybe were not arriving in Palestine for ideological reasons, but were really refugees running away from pogroms in East Europe, did not really make it everywhere. Not everyone fitted to the model of colonization through a kibbutz or a moshav and so on. And they were looking for jobs and cheap housing. And Palestinians were willing to host them. So, for example, and in each case has to be studied by itself, but there were sort of material reasons for us inviting Jews to live inside Palestinian village. I will give you I don't have time for all the examples, but just maybe two examples will suffice just to explain the mechanism. There was a big salt factory in near a village called Idlib, run by Palestinian and a Jewish industrialists. There were more than 1,000 joint industrial projects in Palestine between Jews and Arabs. And the Jews who worked in that salt plant, at first only stayed there for a few hours, but then decided to live next door to the workplace. And they remained, so they were part of the village. In Tantura, Jews Jews who were more affluent, used to have summer houses, for when they wanted to go to the beach inside the villages. In other places, they worked together, or they found this a more suitable solution for individual problems of housing or employment. This was not a massive phenomenon. I mention it not because it was a massive phenomenon, but because they were really ungrateful. They were hosted by the Palestinians, and then they played a very important role in expelling the people that welcomed them with open hands when they had nowhere else to live. I think that for me was just another kind of manifestation of callousness that should be paid attention to.
Okay. What I find interesting is the words, the word acquire, in relation to the JNF. So the JNF was established to acquire the land, and you spoke about part of that meant, actually buying the land. One of the questions that we've had through was why did farmers or landowners agree to sell the land, and how else did they acquire? Although I think you've answered that question in relation to cooperation, and post 48, of course, land was transferred to the JNF.
No, you have to go to the beginning of my lecture, because I talked about it, but I'll repeat it. I talked about the land regime in Palestine. Around the 1860s, the Ottomans have changed the land regime. In places such as Palestine, it was possible for the first time to buy land. Until then, you could only lease land from the state. And the state was selling land, first of all, to people who became rich landowners, such as the Susoks of Beirut. They bought a lot of land in Palestine, especially around Marj ibn Amr. And when we're talking about land, this is not, I think, we need to go out of our world today. A land means a space which will include 10 to 12 villages. Okay, that's the land you buy. You don't buy a dunam or an acre. You buy a land that has on it 15 villages. Now, the custom was very clear under the Ottomans. Yes, the land ownership changed legally, but never has a change of land ownership meant that anything would happen to the tenants, to the farmers. So it's a complex system of land ownership, by which the landowner has some responsibilities towards the tenants have some responsibilities towards the landowners, but there is no transfer of people, there's no movement of people, there's no displacement of people. It's the same village in which they lived since God knows when, centuries. And here comes, and in 1901, the main strategies of the JNF say, and there's a famous letter from Adolf Friedman, who was Theodor Herzl's main advisor on land issues. He came to Palestine in 1901, 1902, I don't remember exactly the year, and he studied the land regime in Palestine. And as you know, the founder and prophet of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, only visited Palestine once. And even that was a very, very short visit. He used to say, because he had no intention himself to go there, like many German Jews and Austrian Jews, they thought it was a solution for Eastern European Jews, not for Western Jews. And this Friedman writes to Herzl in the famous letter. He says, there's very good fertile land in Palestine. Yes, we can buy it from landowners. They are willing to sell it to us because we will offer them 3 or 4 times the value of the land, or even from Palestinian rich landowners. But they don't expect us to remove the people. So we will have the land, but we won't be able to colonize it. So Herzl asks him, so how can we colonize it? Namely, how can we get rid of the people? And he says, under the Ottoman law, we won't be able to do it. So they needed the British to bring this entitlement laws from Europe, and the British police came physically in 1926. This was the litmus paper, paper, kind of the test case study. In 1926, the British police was asked to evict by force people who refused to be evicted because the land ownership has changed. And the British said, well, according to British law, if I buy your flat, I can evict you from your flat if you refuse to be evicted. And that's how they did it. The point is that one of the reasons for the Arab Revolt in 1936 was that it took some time for Palestinian leaders to understand it, but finally they understood that this was the trick. And there was a lot of pressure, and people stopped selling land to the Jews in the 1930s, as I mentioned, and the whole Palestinian movement changed its orientation from sitting idle while Palestine is being colonized to try and do the first intifada in 1936, which was crashed by brutal force by Britain. And it took them 3 years to crash that revolt. And they destroyed the Palestinian military capacity and capability, which was one of the reasons for the Nakba.
Yeah. Sort of fast forwarding to today, we've seen developments in Sheikh Jarrah, settler violence against Palestinians again. What's the relationship with the JNF with other organizations such as Elad, who's involved in sort of East Jerusalem, and some of the sort of dispossession that's happening there, because it's all, they try and say this is all legal, it's all to do with rights to historic rights and all of this. So I guess first of all is could you give an overview to viewers as to what is happening there, and what, if any, is the role of the JNF in that today? Yeah,
well, Sheikh Jarrah is different from the rest of the places, so let's talk about Sheikh Jarrah. There is all over Jerusalem, around the old city, places such as Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah and so on. Before 48, some Jewish families used to live among neighborhoods which were predominantly Palestinian. Because of the agreement between Israel and Jordan, they decided to move to the western part of the city. And I don't think the descendants of these families really care about these houses anymore. But ideologically, the JNF helped to create, few organizations that supposedly are not connected to it, but it's very clear that they are behind it, that are trying to convince descendants of these families to go to the Israeli court and demand redemption of these houses, which of course, if the court had a modicum of decency in it, it would have said to them, okay, you want back your houses, we have to give back the houses of West Jerusalem to the 45,000 Palestinians who were kicked from these houses in 1948 and their descendants, which will be a whole, almost 60% of West Jerusalem should go back to its right owners in Jerusalem. But surprisingly, even for an Israeli court system, they accepted these demands, and therefore they issued a verdict that the families who live now in these houses should be evicted and taken over. Now, the people who would take it over and already have taken over a few houses are not the descendants of these families. This is the youth movement of the settler movement, fanatic neo-fascist Jews who are settling there in order to harass the Palestinian neighbors so as to try and Judaize the whole of Sheikh Jarrah or the whole of Silwan with the protection of the Israeli military and Israeli border police. So this has nothing to do with a wish of people to return to their homes. This has to do with one of the many methods Israel uses in order to Judaize everything that exists in East Jerusalem, around East Jerusalem, where there are, in Israeli eyes, 200,000 Palestinians who are the main obstacle for creating a whole Jewish Jerusalem, so to speak. The JNF plays also an important role in channeling money for settlers in other places in the West Bank, almost in the same way as it did in 1901, kind of recruiting money without clear explanation what the money is for from Jewish communities around the world, and channeling that money to the settler movement, not for buying land. I mean, the settler movement doesn't buy land. Israel expropriates land, but to sustain the expropriation. It's not enough to expropriate land. You need to sustain it, and so on. So, in a way, they are part of a matrix of power that Israel uses in Area C, which Israel targeted as an area that has to be Judaized. The other means are military training, military exercise, allowing vigilantes of the settlers to harass the villages, and creating green lungs, claiming that these are no-go areas. Now, every green lung that is created in the West Bank is a JNF green lung. So they are very deeply involved in the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Area C that is happening as we speak.
Yeah. So what is this? Because in recent weeks we've been hearing about the JNF now, being given the green light and agreeing that they can go ahead and operate in the West Bank. Whereas, what you've just said, and many years ago, I traveled through the West Bank, and you can see the JNF, logo up in the Jordan Valley. Of course, they've been there. So, could you explain what is the conversation now happening that we see in Haaretz about?
I know it's it's a bit confusing. So I'll explain that. Originally, or officially, the JNF was not allowed to operate in the West Bank in buying land to develop existing settlements. This is the change. I mean, if you see signs of the JNF in the Jordan Valley, it's because the Jordan Valley and other places like Gush Etzion are not are part of the Israeli consensus. So the JNF was allowed to work there. What has changed is that while in other parts, especially in Area C, the JNF was working through front organizations in order to pressure Palestinians to sell land or to pressure the army to expropriate land, mainly not so much for creating new settlements, but for expanding existing settlement. The Likud, I think was in February this year, if I'm not mistaken, decided to make it official, and which means that contribution from Jews in Britain, especially Britain, Canada, Australia, and the United States, and already these donations are at the hundreds of millions of pounds, are now waiting to be channeled into the expansion and development of existing settlements, and the main body that would overlook both the recruitment of the money and channeling the money for whatever it means to develop an existing settlement This will now officially be part of the missions of the JNF. This is the change. So the JNF, you're right, JNF was involved from the very beginning, from 1967, in expanding Jewish settlements, but never officially, and always through front organizations. And the only places where it acted more officially was in the Jordan Valley and Gush Etzion, because these were areas that there was an Israeli consensus. But now it's all over Area C, and this is the money, by the way, doesn't come only from Jewish sources. The Christian fundamentalists are giving financial support, unprecedented financial support for the Jewish settlements. I don't know if you know, but they're sending volunteers every year. Young Christians are coming in their hordes every year to work in the settlements and help to expand them. And also the JNF organizes this this aid.
Okay. Now we're 5 minutes, just almost 5 minutes past the hour. I've got a couple more questions, and then maybe we can wind up to quarter past, if that's okay. One of the questions, sort of looping back in a way, about the role of the JNF post 48. So the question was, why does the state of Israel need the JNF? You know, once the state was established, why didn't the government just take care of its own business? You know, why did it need a separate agency for that? So yeah, maybe a little bit around that, because I think that ties back to what you were saying about the JNF's role, you know, after 48, you know, in Israel Land Authority, you know, maybe like that. And I've got one other question to follow up from that.
Okay, yes. In order to understand why Israel needed the JNF, there are two levels of explanation. One has to do, maybe a good example from a totally different aspect of life. We can rightly ask, why do dictatorships need to carry out elections in which they are elected with 99.9% of the vote? They are dictators. Why do they go every few years to be democratically elected? Because they want to play this charade that they are legitimately ruling a country for all their life, for 55 years. In a similar way, one has to understand that the historical timing of the Zionist movement as a settler colonial movement meant that it needed, and still needs, to play a certain charade of legality, whether it's international legality, whether it's domestic legality, for particular the most illegal part of its actions. And therefore, you sometimes don't want the government directly be involved in what is apparently and blatantly a violation of human rights, of civil rights, or even the Israeli laws themselves. So you need someone else to do it. Thus, for instance, you don't want to pass in the Israeli Knesset in 1949 a moment of celebration, the Jewish state after 2,000 years of exile, the Jewish answer to the Holocaust, all the ambassadors from the Western world are there. You don't want to pass a law which says our Arab citizens will not be able to buy land, not able to have jobs, would be treated very much like Africans are treated according to the 1948 apartheid law. You don't do that. In fact, you publish the famous Israeli Declaration of Independence, which says that Israel would not allow any discrimination on any basis for all its citizens, regardless of who they are. So you give the land to the Jewish National Fund that in its charter is obliged to make sure that the land always remains in the hands, and this is what it says, in the hands of the Jewish people, not the Jewish people in Palestine, the hands of the Jewish people. So the Jews from Brooklyn can buy land in the Galilee, but the Palestinian from the Galilee could not even buy back a land that belongs to him, that was expropriated from him in 1948. So this is one reason you needed in the 50s and the 60s the JNF, because the Judaization process was illegal even according to Israeli law, or the Israeli ethos of being the only democracy in the Middle East. So the JNF was a very convenient agency that was off the radar and doing all these totally illegal expropriation of lands that led to expulsion and so on, the Judaization of the Galilee and the Nakab, and later on as they do now in Area C. So that's one explanation why you need it. Israel is a racist ethnic state, but it is regarded in the West as the only democracy in the Middle East. So you need racist ethnic agencies or agents to do the job, and you don't want the government to do that. The second reason is, of course, that these bodies become very rich and they employ a lot of people and they need to justify themselves and they don't want to disappear. So it's also part of the reason the JNF is still there. This is part why the Jewish Agency is still there, which is even more an anachronism, even in Israeli terms, than the JNF. So it is also there because of that, because it has a lot of money, it has a lot of assets from which a lot of people profit individually, and they don't want to sell this milking cow to anyone else. But I think in the 50s and the 60s, the government needed, maybe I'll just give one short example, then we'll move to your next place. Probably the most civilized manifestation of a new Jewish state was the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Jews from all over the world, scholars were gathering together, building a university, showing that after the Holocaust, Jews are still scholars and scientists and so on. It was the pearl, or the jewel in the crown. And there was a campus on Mount Scopus, which was bought from a British person who bought it from a Palestinian, never mind, but there was a campus. The campus was unavailable because of the fighting with the Jordanians. So you want to build a new campus for the Hebrew University. And the JNF says to the founders or the leaders of the Hebrew University, why don't you build it on the ruins of the village En Badr? Because, Sheikh Badr, sorry, because it's a village which is near Jerusalem. This is where we want to build the government offices anyway. You should be next to it. We will build the Supreme Court there. So you can have the village as the basis for your university, for your campus. Now, the government doesn't want it to give it directly. So the government gives the territory to the JNF, and the JNF sells it through another agency, I won't go into it, for I think £1 to the Hebrew University. So supposedly it was a legal purchase of land to build a campus. Actually, it was building a campus on the ruins of a Palestinian village. The same was done with the University of Tel Aviv, built on the ruins of the village of Sheikh Marwanis. Yeah. So they needed this agency for completing the pillage and the takeover.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ilan. Just conscious of the time now, I have a question, a big question, but before I ask that and ask you to respond and with your final words as well, I just say to the viewers, the Stop the JNF campaign exists to challenge the JNF, because the JNF exists. They have offices around the world in over 50 countries around the world. So there are opportunities for us to do that, but there are also part of our work is to expose and document the role of the JNF in the ongoing ethnic cleansing, protesting JNF fundraisers, for example, where, in Canada and Scotland, there have been successful challenges there, and opposing the JNF's charitable or tax exempt status where in our countries. And we're working with Salman Abu Sitta, with Palestinian Nakba survivors, you know, organizations like Zochrot in Israel, who are doing really important work in terms of remembering the destroyed villages and working with Palestinian survivors as well. So what we'd like is for you, because I know this is an international audience, to get in touch with us. If you go to our website, stopthejnf.org, you can let us know, you can join the mailing list, but part of that form is to let us know that you'd like to get involved. And we have a number of different projects ongoing. COP26 is happening in Glasgow this year. This is, you know, an international gathering. We have a call on our website to keep the JNF out of COP26 because of their claim to be an environmental organization through all the tree planting to bury Palestinian villages. They do usually try to attend these events. There's also a more general call for action that we'd like you to look at as well. Somebody asked, one of the questions asked was about planting trees, you know, working with Palestinians on the ground. There are many different, you know, planting trees, but Palestinian plant a tree projects. We're involved with partners in Palestine, and very specifically to link and to raise the history, the political issues around the role of the JNF, but also in solidarity to support Palestinian resistance on the ground, who are, you know, day to day planting trees as a show of resistance to hang on to the land that they still have. So please get in touch. You see the contact details just here and on our website. And Nakba Day, finally, in the short term, we've got Nakba Day happening next week. Wherever you are, Badil is asking if you would send them their photos and short videos to them, just so that they can post it up on their website. There's an email address, but we'll post that up on the Facebook page as well. So that's a very quick, there's a lot of exciting things happening, and we're working with international Palestinian, Israeli organizations and groups as well, hopefully to take this further. Now, my final question, Ilan, which is a big question. Somebody asked, you know, is there hope? Now, for us, I mean, I'm based in Scotland, in the UK. The JNF is still a very important organization in the Israel lobby groups. You know, they're still very proudly Zionist, very proud to take their position in defending the state of Israel and the Zionist cause. Now, we've seen, we're seeing around the world, you know, smear campaigns, attempts to change legislation to try and outlaw BDS and to really curtail the activism and discussion around, you know, academics are getting attacked and for pro-Palestine advocacy. At the same time, for me, I got involved in 2001 in Palestine Solidarity. I think for me today, there are even more opportunities. There are more people who are involved and know about Palestine through social media, etc. There's a lot of information out there, and through books such as the one you've authored. But yet people say, well, BDS isn't really working. We need to try something else. So I guess my question to you is, do you see, is Zionism as a movement in decline, or do you see it getting stronger? Do you think the movement for BDS, where it's very specific in terms of pressure, has that had an impact, and should we continue with what we're doing, you know, whether that's pressurizing institutions here that are complicit, corporations, and exposing our own governments and institutions in their role in what's happening in Israel-Palestine? A big question, I know, to end today.
Yeah, it will be only a very concise version of it. I think that, you know, Israel is a state, is a Zionist state, if you want, really stands on two pillars. A material pillar, a very strong one, strong economy, strong strategic relationship with multinational corporations, with countries such as Russia and China, and of course the West, high-tech nations, and economically probably did better than many other countries during the 2008 crisis and even during the COVID-19 crisis. The other pillar is the moral pillar, and this was really eroded significantly due to the work of organizations like yours, the BDS, the drastic shift in public opinion in the civil society all around the world. And we are beginning to see some of that change in the civil society reaching the politics from above in positions of, of potential leaders of political parties, some writings in the mainstream media, and definitely the academia has changed dramatically in this respect. So the civil society solidarity movement and the BDS movement in it contributed significantly to a pressure from public opinion on the governments, on the political elites, to change policies on the ground, to change their policies toward Israel and Palestine. However, we're not there yet, it's obvious. The governments have not changed the policies as yet. The mainstream media is still not changing the way it covers these issues. And therefore, if there is a potential compression from the outside to change the reality on the ground, we don't know it yet because that pressure needs to come, as happened in the campaign against apartheid South Africa, also from above. It's not enough to have boycott and divestment. You need sanctions, for example, to make it effective. And we don't have sanctions against Israel as such. So I think that this is one of the major struggles we need to continue, we need to enhance, we need to strengthen. But I think basically looking back since the beginning of this century, I think it's effective, it's powerful, it's not enough. That's very clear. But it should continue, to my mind. I don't see any alternative. But one has to take into account that if you want to stop the colonization and the oppression and the occupation of the Palestinians, this would not be enough. There are other things that have to happen. The Palestinians themselves have an agency in this, to be united, to be democratized, to push forward their own struggle in a more effective way and not a fragmented way, which of course is a big ask given the way they were fragmented in 1948. We probably need to see whether the Arab Spring is going to resurface, because you need a change in the Arab world if you want to make sure that things in Palestine change. And maybe you need a European Spring, an American Spring, where democratically the governments would represent what many people want. I think we should work more on the politics of identification between the communities that are oppressed, such as the African Americans, the workers, and so on. I think that there's a need for even a stronger international solidarity that connects struggles in each location with the struggle in Palestine. If you don't know enough about the oppression that happens in your own place, I don't think you're very effective in, and it can easily be exposed if you're just criticizing oppression in Palestine. I think these kinds of campaigns have to fuse together, otherwise you lose your moral validity, and people will rightly ask you, why Palestine? What about workers in Scotland, for instance? What about the fact that the United Kingdom as a whole has not hardly received any refugee, and so on? So I think these issues have to be put together as part of the solidarity movement. It should not be discrete, it should not be fragmented, it has to be international. And I think that it would be more effective. So yes, the short answer is, it is effective, it should continue. It is, don't expect immediate dividends in the short run. There are other processes that have to take place that do not depend on you. but you should do your part, because one day maybe the other processes would mature, and then your part will become even more important than it is today.
Thank you, Ilan. But yes, a lot to do, and
Absolutely.
for the long haul, for sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Ilan,
Thank you all
for your
Thank you.
time. It's been very valuable. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Again, contact us. Contact details here. If you have questions afterwards, please email. And a good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All
And
right.
see you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.